Hey guys, it's Amy. Welcome to the channel, or welcome back. I hope that you're doing well. Let me know how you're doing in the comments below. Today we are talking about my October reads, my reading wrap up, and I read 10 books in this month, and it was definitely a mixture of like quality in reads. I tried to kind of dabble in some different things, but I did have a 5-star read this month, and I did have some really good reads. So even though it was a little bit all over the map, I am excited to talk about these books. And this month has been kind of interesting, like personally for me. I definitely have had some health issues, like major kind of flare-ups. I think I've talked about it in previous videos, but I deal with like different chronic illnesses, but have been trying to hone in on making content and how I can make it better. I recently reorganized my shelves. I've displayed my chakra-boardy works here. It's kind of like half and half. Like half is my husband's, half is mine. So I'm kind of covering some of it, but I think maybe play around with it a little bit. It's one thing when I'm doing like a wide shot for YouTube and another when I'm doing vertical for social media and things like that. So we'll play around with it, but let me know what you think of it. But let's get into these books. So I am just going in the order that I read these, and my first read was my 5-star read, and that was Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wong. This is kind of like a dark academia, higher fantasy, and I really enjoyed this. It was very unique. I enjoyed it more than her previous book, The Sword of Kaigen. I think it was just better paced. I think that it wasn't like, even though there are heavy things and there is a lot of depth, emotional depth to this story, there was more space to breathe between the intense moments, unlike Sword of Kaigen, where it was just like trauma, trauma, trauma. Even though The Sword of Kaigen is a great book, I think that this was even better. So we're following our main character, Siona, who is the first female in a decade to be able to audition to become a high mage in her university. It's like a higher up position, and she's the first female to ever get in. But she is faced with so much prejudice and misogyny, and she lives in this society where magic is kind of like scientific calculations, almost like coding. You have to like type it out on this kind of typewriter device, and the magic is really interesting where it has to have like this power source. And it's also a very divided society where there is one group of people who are kind of like ostracized, and the other people who originate within this city are higher up within society, if that makes sense. And it really explores political oppression, explores prejudices with like race and ethnicity, obviously with misogyny. And there's just so much packed within this book, but it's done in such a lovely way where everything, even though it is really difficult, there are a lot of triggers with this book. I will list those for you, but it is just so beautifully done and well crafted. You really get to see like the introspection, especially of the main character, where you're kind of like, the main character is questioning her beliefs, and you're kind of questioning along with her and seeing slowly more and more where corruption is within the society. And it just felt, even though it's in a fantasy world, in this sort of fantastical city where it's run by magic, it still, I feel like, packs a punch where it is applicable to everyday situations that we deal with. It is definitely an emotionally intense read, but I feel like it does like ebb and flow in a way where you can digest it, even though it is difficult. But this was so fantastic. I absolutely love this. This probably is going to be one of my favorite books of the year. And it's rare for me to give that kind of praise. So it was just so well written, and I loved the magic system. I loved the characters and just all of the issues that it explored. It was just done in such a great way. My next read, I wanted something that was kind of like a thriller, Gothic feeling story. So I went with the classic that I feel like a lot of people recommend, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's kind of this like slow building sort of Gothic story about a young woman who marries an older widower, but she begins to be kind of haunted by the memory of his deceased first wife. And it is very atmospheric. You're kind of in this creepy old house in England, and there's definitely like kind of unhinged characters, and you just kind of see the story unfold and get understanding of the past along with the main character. And I didn't love this book. It was definitely like a thrilling ride, but I felt like there were times when it was kind of slow and dragged on, especially towards the end. But that's just my opinion. But I see why it is so popular. I think for the time when it was written, it would have been, pretty shocking. It's not like super scary, but it's definitely like creepy and eerie. There are some intense moments, but it was fun for October for the spooky season. So if you want something that's like a gothic thriller that's not too scary, then I would recommend this. My next read is probably one of the most interesting books that I read this month, and that is Piranesi by Susanna Clark. And I know she has other works that are pretty famous along with this one. I know she has a newer book that's coming out, or it's already come out, I'm not sure. But this is a book where I feel like the consensus online is that you don't really talk about what it's about. So I don't want to give too much away within the plot, but it's a story following a man who lives in this very strange, very expansive house, and he is like basically cataloging his days and what he finds within this huge house. It is so strange, it's very mysterious, and you kind of get understanding as the story unfolds, and it just kind of takes you on this wild ride. Not wanting to like give anything away, but it was reminding me of a previous book that I read, but Piranesi was much better than this book. But Slade House by David Mitchell. That is more of a horror book. This was not as like horror. This was more kind of like literary fiction with kind of some fantasy elements. But I felt like the kind of weird magic that kind of happens was kind of reminding me of it. So if you're familiar with that book, it kind of gives me that similar feeling. If you don't want anything given away, I'm just going to like put on the screen what this book kind of gave me the feeling of. Okay, you can look now. It's a very interesting book if you're wanting something that is like mysterious and thought provoking, but it's still like a short read. I would recommend this. In the months of September and October, I really wanted to get into the spooky vibes and get into weird books so that I can give these kind of recommendations for you. And I definitely picked up a weird book. My next book is Pizza Girl by Jean Kyung Fraser. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And this is what the book community is calling part of weird girl fiction. And we're following a young woman who she's 18, she's pregnant, she lives in LA, and she is a pizza delivery girl. And she kind of becomes obsessed with a female customer. And it is very unhinged. Like from the beginning, it just feels like the unfiltered, unhinged thoughts of a young pregnant woman. And it's very funny from the beginning. It kind of gets more unhinged and a little more uncomfy as we go. And it was a very interesting read, but I really enjoyed the writing style. It was just a very refreshing kind of writing style in that it just didn't really hold back. And it was just kind of like this slice of life story. It's just kind of like dealing with how we struggle with like self discovery and understanding at young adulthood. You turn 18, you're young, you're trying to understand who you are as an adult. And definitely as someone who's pregnant is very difficult, but it explores a lot of interesting issues in addition to just pregnancy and young adulthood. It explores like grief and loss, and it also explores like alcoholism in kind of a visceral way. So just be aware of that. And there are some triggers with this, definitely. There's kind of some weird spice in this book. And yeah, it's definitely weird and unhinged. So definitely not one that I would recommend for everybody. But if none of that deters you and you are into something that is just kind of weird, I think I would recommend. There's also exploring like sexual identity. And there's just a lot of like trying to understand yourself within this book. So if that sounds appealing to you, I might recommend, but just be wary. This is a weird girl book. Now, after Piranesi and Pizza Girl, I was kind of like, I've had my fill of like weird books. So I went into some YA fantasy and I read An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. I really enjoyed her book, The Sorcery of Thorns. I read that, I believe, at the beginning of 2024. And I had been wanting to read this one. It kind of gave me fall vibes on the cover, but it actually explores every season within the book. But this is following a girl who does these kind of whimsical, magical paintings of fae, that she lives near the fae realm, and these fae come to get portraits done by her. They are just kind of sort of magical paintings in a way, but she one day gets a client who ends up being a fae prince, and they sort of develop a rapport, a relationship. But she paints a painting of him, and it kind of depicts something that is controversial to his court. And so he comes and collects her and is like, I have to bring you before the court and you have to be tried. You have insulted me and this, that, and the other. And so they kind of go on this journey and get to know each other, and the story just kind of unfolds from there. But this kind of gave me, like, if it was a young adult, like ACOTAR vibes. It's a much shorter book, but it honestly, like, I was talking with my husband about it and I was like, I feel like this is what I would have wanted ACOTAR to be. I felt like the writing was really solid, even though it's a quick read, it is YA. It was still very romantic and whimsical. You have all these like seasonal courts of the different fae, and it just kind of was this easy, beautiful read, and I really enjoyed it. I think with YA fantasy, like, I'm pretty picky with it. And even though this was like kind of romanticy vibes, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really fun. I really liked getting to kind of explore this romantic relationship and see it grow. And it was just a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. So if you like the idea of Fae and something that is kind of like ACOTAR, which this actually came out before ACOTAR. I checked the publishing dates. So I'm not saying anything, but it, there were a lot of similarities. I'm just saying. But anyway, I really enjoyed it. So if any of that sounds up your alley, kind of maybe a YA version of ACOTAR, then you might enjoy it. Okay, so my next book, I feel a little bit conflicted about reviewing because I feel like I didn't give it a full-hearted listen. Um, I'll explain. I was definitely having like a major flare up during the time that I was listening to the audiobook for this. This is Betwixt. It's the first book of the Betwixt and Between series by Dorinda Jones. And this is kind of like a cozy fantasy romantasy. It's dealing with like witches and like the paranormal, but it's funny, it's cute. We're following a woman who mysteriously inherits a house from someone she doesn't know in Salem, Massachusetts. She's from Phoenix, Arizona. She just got divorced, so she's like, okay, I will go and check it out, see what's going on. And as she's there trying to like, get the feel of her surroundings and the house, people start showing up to her house and are like, can you help me find things? Can you help me, with these different tasks, because they believe that she is a witch. And she just might be. So the story just kind of unfolds from there. And there's a lot of intrigue and mystery within this book dealing with witches. It was a lot of fun. It was humorous. There's this love interest that I feel like it was kind of overdone with, like, oh, he's so like hot and hunky and all this stuff. I felt like that was a little bit overdone, but it's still like fun and humorous. It definitely left on like a major cliffhanger, but if you like the idea of kind of like a paranormal, cozy fantasy with some romance, with some witches, and just something that's a fun, humorous time, I'd probably recommend. So I was really enjoying the cozy fantasy vibes, so I read Sword and Thistle by S.L. Rowland. This is the second book of his that I read. He is a creator over on TikTok, and I just really enjoy his writing, his cozy fantasies. And this was in the same like world as his first book, Cursed Cocktails, but we're following a different character, a totally different story. We're following an adventurer named Dobbin who is hired for just different jobs, and there is like this secret magic dinner club who wants to hire him to find these magical mushrooms that will help them like commune with God or something like that. And so he is doing research and goes to find out where he can find these mushrooms. And he has to go on kind of this interesting magical journey. And he meets all these interesting characters and magical creatures. There's a little bit of stakes in there as well, but it was just really fun. And it was kind of like a really low key version of like The Hobbit. It kind of gave me those vibes where it's just like you're going on this kind of magical journey and having to retrieve something, that sort of thing. So I definitely enjoyed it. I've listened to this as an audiobook. I believe that this is on Kindle Unlimited. I listened to the audiobook through Hoopla, so it is accessible like through your library or through Kindle Unlimited, but I really enjoyed it. I enjoy his writing. It's just really cozy, but still really magical and whimsical at the same time. There is some language in it. There's like some closed door spice in it. So it is like more of an adult cozy fantasy, but it's nothing like super intense. So it's cozy, it's magical, it's fun. My next read was one that really surprised me that I liked, and that was me finally jumping on the bandwagon to read One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. I finally did it, and I really enjoyed it. It really surprised me. I gave it 4 stars. It was just kind of fast paced, it was easy to read, but it still had an interesting magical system that was easy to understand. I enjoyed the romance in it. But if you don't know anything about the plot, we're following a young girl who kind of has this weird sort of magical curse on her that happened when she was 11 years old. And she kind of like hears this mysterious voice in her head. There's like kind of this presence that lives in her head. And we're in a world where there are like these magical cards. People call them tarot cards. I don't really know if I would say they're tarot cards, but they do have different magical abilities. And she is kind of part of the magic where it's seen as a negative thing. The magical cards are okay, but the magic that came on by this sickness, this fever, is really frowned upon. So she's kind of like hidden away, and she kind of gets tangled up in this situation where they are trying to find these magical cards in order to help save someone. And she's thinking, I can be saved as well from this weird presence that lives in my head. So it's really interesting. There's definitely like there's some high stakes in here, but it just feels kind of like dark and gothic, but it's still kind of like whimsical at the same time. There's a great romance in there. There is some spice in there, so just be aware of that. And obviously some violence in there, but it was a really fun read, and it left on this crazy cliffhanger. So I was like, I have to read the next book so I can find out what's going on. I'm currently reading Two Twisted Crowns, and it's definitely interesting starting off, so I'm curious to see where the story goes. I know people have said that the second book is even better than the first, so I'm excited to see where the story ends up. My next book was a cozy mystery that unfortunately was kind of a letdown, and that is Catch Me If You Candy by Ellie Alexander. And this is part of a cozy mystery series, but we're following a woman who owns a bakery in this small town in Oregon, and one day there is a random dead body in front of her bakery, and so this murder mystery kind of unfolds. And I really liked the premise of it. I liked the idea of like small town and there's a bakery and just a local like trying to solve this cozy mystery, which I feel like is pretty typical of a cozy mystery plot. But it just had some weird elements to it. It was like trying to incorporate like modern language and like different progressive ideas, but still at the same time had like weird elements that I feel like aged the story as well, where it was like having like this elderly woman's like mahjong club, you know, like the mahjong tiles, and just kind of having like weird like dinner parties and things like that. There was like this local community theater, and it was like trying to like throw Shakespeare in there, and it was just kind of a weird mixture of elements. And I found some of the characters to be kind of annoying. It was like there's this woman who has like this dog, and she's like kind of like snobbish and fussy, and she's like, my dog's going to be famous and he's going to be in this play and commercials and whatever. And it was just kind of bizarre characters, and I feel like it just didn't quite know what it wanted to be as a story. And I understand like having mystery where it's like you have maybe some red herrings trying to like lead you down different paths and keep you guessing, but I felt like it was just kind of all over the place. So I gave this 2 stars. I think it wasn't personally for me. I just wasn't a huge fan of the characters of the plot line, and those are pretty major aspects of a book. So I personally wouldn't recommend this cozy mystery. My last read for the month was an arc that I was reached out to by this independent publishing company to read this book. It's a middle grade, kind of cozier fantasy, and it is Nora and the Mermaid's Monster by D.E. Knight. And this was a really cute kind of middle grade fantasy. We're dealing with kind of this cute little magical town that's kind of hidden away from the world. And magic users, you have to be like an adult, but they are scriveners. So they have like quills that almost act as like a magic wand. And it's a really interesting magical system and a really unique magical world. But we're following a little girl who lives with her large family in this really interesting town. There's like magical carriages, they call them cabbies, that like transport you places, and there's different magical beings. And one day there is part of this festival, some of the townsfolk bring this mermaid to town, and she's in like this huge tank, and she's there for a few days, and then she suddenly disappears. And so Nora, our main character, and her friends are trying to figure out this mystery and see what happened to this mermaid. And Nora had kind of like befriended the mermaid, and so she's really concerned about her. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really cute. I do feel like the writing was a little bit more juvenile in just that it was for a younger audience. I think if you like middle grade fantasy stories, that you don't mind something that's kind of like cutesy, something that maybe leans a little more juvenile in writing, you may enjoy this. I personally think it's for a younger audience. When you look it up on Goodreads, it says magical mystery adventure for tweens and teens ages 9 to 13, grades 4 to 7. And I feel like that's a pretty good depiction of like the audience that this is for. I think, you know, whoever could really read it if you want to, but I think that that is probably the core audience that this is geared towards. But it was still a really cute and fun kind of magical fantasy mystery. Okay guys, that is everything that I read in the month of October. I hope that you enjoyed this and that you potentially got something out of this video, something new to read. And I definitely want to know if you've read any of these and what you read in the month of October. I really enjoyed these reads, even though they were kind of all over the map, but I still had a lot of fun with it. And I'm definitely looking forward to the next couple of months as far as the books that I have planned to read. I definitely know I'm reading The Will of the Many. I'm really excited to read that book, but let's chat in the comments and I will see you guys soon. Bye!